Hi, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. So welcome if you're just joining. We're going to get started in about a minute or two. This would be a good time to mute yourself if you've got any background noise. Actually, mute yourself regardless. And then also think about updating your Zoom name so that it has your first and last name, if you'd like, your pronouns, and also your affiliation, if all that will fit. Great. We'll just wait one more minute as people are coming in at a steady clip. I'm really appreciating Michael's mountain or butte scene right now. No, Michael, but I like looking at the mountain you've got there.
That was taken on the Pacific Crest Trail last summer.
Okay, Finn. Where is that?
It's just north of Ashland.
Okay, lovely. Nina, I like your mountain background too.
So we cruised up 185 miles over Crater Lake and with my son. It's pretty cool.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like a dream trip with a child, especially. Okay, I think we have a pretty packed agenda today. So even though folks are still coming in, I think we should get started. Vin, are you okay with us getting going?
That sounds good.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everybody. So you are here today at the second of 5 Buildings Working Group meetings. And our theme today is equitable energy. More on that coming up. If this is the first meeting you are attending, welcome. If you participated in the last working group meeting, welcome back. And if you didn't participate in the first meeting, but wish that you did, I'm about to post to you a link in the chat to a recording of that meeting. My name is Marty Frank. I am your facilitator for these sessions, and we are all delighted that you're here today because we have some very important items to discuss and we need your help. So you are here today to provide input into this policy. We're asking you to speak to your values, to your vision, to your questions, and to your expertise. So in the first Buildings Working Group meeting 2 weeks ago, we focused on learning. So we learned about building performance standards. This is a broader category of policies that we are here to talk about. We heard from a national policy expert who's again here with us today, from our leaders at the city, about how these types of policies tend to work, and about some of the other places where they've already been put into effect. We also heard from 2 regional building decarbonization experts about the types of technologies that we can deploy over the next 20 to 30 years to both reduce carbon emissions and also make buildings safer, healthier places to live and work. And I want to just touch on that for another minute because the work that we're doing here in Portland is a little bit different than in other places. So our focus is not just on reducing carbon emissions, but also on health and resilience and equity. And so that is why, while the policy that we're talking about falls into this broader category of building performance standards, here in Portland, we're calling it climate and health standards policy, right? Climate and health. So in that first meeting, right, talking about this climate and health standards policy, we also spent time in small group discussion, talking about the questions that you all had about this policy. And so before we dive into today's agenda on equitable energy, we wanted to answer some of your questions in a short Q&A session. So the job of answering those questions falls to Vinh Mason, Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the City of Portland and the leader of this policy development process. So Vin, I'd like to call you up to the virtual stage. We have 6 questions for you. These are all pretty big picture type questions. They came up quite a bit in last week's small group discussion. So first thing, Vin, that people are curious to know is who will be writing this policy and how will it be developed?
Great. Good question. So the policy will be written through the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and the climate team. So that includes the folks that are here today, myself, as well as Andrea Jacob, my manager. Thanks for waving, Andrea, and Dirk Larson, my colleague on the team. So we will be responsible for writing. We will have guidance from Commissioner Rubio's office, though, in review.
Thanks, Vin. I'm sorry, were you done?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you got 5 more questions, so you can sneak that answer into one of the others. Okay. Second question: will this policy apply in Portland area only, or will it also reach up to the state level?
Just at the City of Portland, there is another effort happening at the state level too, called the Rebuilding Task Force, but that's just getting initiated. We're already several years into our process.
Okay, great. So this one's a little bit kind of general, but people were curious about how this climate health standards policy might interact with other policies at play in the city already.
Yeah, so some of you know we already have a commercial energy reporting program. That's an ordinance that passed in 2015 that requires annual reporting for the 1,000 largest commercial buildings in Portland. So there's already quite a bit of information that is shared with the city and then disclosed on a map. And I'll share more on that at the 4th meeting on May 25th. There are also, we're coordinating with other bureaus within the city, including the Housing Bureau's Rental Services Office, as well as the Bureau of Development Services. Okay.
Fantastic. So here's an important one. People were wondering if there would be a fee associated with this policy. So for example, would carbon emitters be charged?
So currently, we are not proposing a fee at this time. There are other funding streams, but I think when we get to, again, that meeting on May 25th, when we look at implementation as the area of focus. So we want to explore the standards first, what they might be, and then look at implementation. I think we need to consider how are we going to fund city staff? How are we going to fund resources for building owners? And then how are we going to fund improvements? And I think we'll maybe not initially, this is a long-term policy, but over time we will have to find a funding stream. And so we should discuss what that might look like. A fee is one potential pathway to do that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So last 2 questions really about stakeholders and the role of this group. So people are wondering what the city and the Build Shift team are looking for from the stakeholders in these working groups. How can these stakeholders best support the priorities that were identified by the Build Shift team and by the community?
Yeah, so the policy concept is available and you also have access to that, and it's on our website as well. There is quite a bit of background on the website, including a case study for an international case study through C40. That within there, you see a lot of the background on the community-led approach we took with the Build Shift team to develop the policy concept. And then with this group, we're looking at fleshing out some of what that concept would be in preparation for ordinance development. But there will be additional stakeholder engagement that continues beyond this working group as well, including circling back with the Build Shift community, as well as meeting with private property owners and regulated affordable housing developers.
Thanks, Vin. And last question, people were wondering how you all at the city plan to take the input from this working group into account as you're developing this policy.
Yeah, so to be clear, what we're doing right now is not making the decisions of the details of the ordinance. What we're doing right now is collecting more information and feedback on how to refine the policy concept to be more detailed so that we can write an ordinance. So that's where your information is really kind of in what you bring to the table of all of your expertise. And we have a lot of varied backgrounds here, is to feed into what the next version of this concept would be.
Thanks, Van. And thanks to all of you who posed such great questions in the working group meeting last week. I do want to let you know that, while we lifted up these 6 questions to talk about, we tallied a total of 29 distinct policy questions that you all posed at the last working group. And we have been using those to develop the agendas for this and the future sessions. And in the interest of time, I think we'll share with you by email kind of how some of those questions are going to be addressed in each of the coming meetings. But before we dig into today, we wanted to share one other recap with you. So you might already know, you might not, that there is another working group meeting in parallel to this one. It's called the Tenant Working Group. And the facilitator for that group, Irene Kim, is here with us today. And I'd love to invite her up to share what that group covered in its first meeting last week. Irene.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all again. Yeah, so I'll just provide a very quick recap of the tenant working group meeting that happened last week at the same time. And the tenant working group was made up of mostly community-based organizations. There's a lot of other folks in this room that were also attended that meeting as well. And we asked 2 questions. Sorry, I'm having some internet issues. I'm going to turn my video off. I apologize for that. We asked 2 questions that we discussed in small groups. And the questions were, what are the experiences that your community or your organization are struggling with related to climate change? So wanted to sort of understand and hear from community members and organizations some lived experiences and some stories. So a lot of things that we heard were rent and energy cost burdens disproportionately falling on BIPOC communities, and energy efficient buildings are typically not affordable, and they tend to be double the cost of or more of, or energy costs tend to be double for folks living in more inefficient buildings. A lot of fear and sort of a sense of urgency around having experienced the record-breaking heat dome and wildfire events in the past few years. It's really causing people to have a lot of fear around their health, their quality of life, and having obviously major impacts on public health, and it feels like it's getting worse. There's a lot of people talked about those living in poverty are especially vulnerable to more cascading impacts. So here we heard stories of folks who live in poor quality housing, getting diagnosed with asthma, and then that impacting their job and maybe even losing their work, and then not being able to afford a cleaner home. So it has sort of additional impacts, or these events are having additional impacts on folks. We also asked about what's exciting to them about the Hart standards and what key concerns and priorities they have. So lots of excitement about that the Hart standards are really centering community and prioritizing equitable energy, affordability, and anti-displacement impacts. A lot of excitement that the standards are encompassing how policies can benefit and serve minorities and minority contractors. And lots of comments about just looking forward to discussing ways that the policy can be kind of a win-win situation for landlords and tenants and all the stakeholders involved. And also there's a real sense of urgency. Obviously, 2050 is a long time, and a lot of folks feel like there needs to be really concrete steps and change every year. So those are some of the highlights. And yeah, I'll turn it back over to Marty. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene, for that recap. Okay, so on to today. So I mentioned that the focus today is equitable energy. I've just put the big picture agenda into the chat. So we have 2 pieces on the agenda. So the first is on renewable energy. The second is on carbon standards and energy efficiency. And each piece is going to roll out essentially the same way. We're going to start with some short presentations, do a little Q&A with the presenters, and then move into small group discussions. So you'll be in small group discussions twice during the day today. And now I must give you the requisite Zoom etiquette and reminder. So please stay on mute unless we're in Q&A or in small group discussions. I want to suggest that you consider hiding your self view. Go to the upper right corner of anybody's screen actually and click those 3 dots. Another good way to help stay focused is to put yourself on Do Not Disturb on your phone and on your computer. And then I also want to invite you to participate kind of in any way that's available to you. So using the chat to pose questions or comments, using the reactions to respond to what you're hearing. And then finally, if you're having any technical issues, please use the chat to message Wing. I'm pretty sure he's the only Wing in the meeting today. With that, we will get started with some very quick introductions. So today we're going to do, most of us are going to do our introductions in the chat. And so I want to invite you to use the chat to tell everyone your organization or your affiliation, your name, if it is not already part of your Zoom name. And also I want to invite you, if you were at the first working group meeting, could you tell us something that you learned? Or maybe something that you found yourself kind of thinking about, perseverating about after the meeting. And if you didn't attend the previous working group meeting, do you want to share with us a question that you brought with you into the meeting today? And I know I just gave you a bunch of things, so I'm also going to put that into the chat. Okay, and while you all are putting those items into the chat, I want to turn the floor over to Vinh Mason again to introduce the Build Shift team and then get us started on our first piece of the agenda on renewable energy.
Yeah, thanks everyone for entering your names into the chat and for answering those couple questions. Just very simply, to meet the Build Shift team, I would like to call on them to if you're comfortable, come off video and unmute. To say hello and your name, pronouns, and affiliation. We'll also have a member of each, one of the team members in each of the breakout discussion groups. So I am one of the members. I've already introduced myself previously, but Vinh Mason, City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, I use he, him pronouns. So let's see, is Misha here? Would you like to introduce yourself real quick? How about Taryn?
Good afternoon, everyone. Taryn Evans, she, her pronouns. I'm the Environmental Justice Director at the Coalition of Communities of Color. I unfortunately wasn't able to join the meeting last week, but because I had a conflict, but yeah, really happy to be here today.
Thanks, Taryn. How about Derek?
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Thompson, co-director of Leaders Become Legends. Been part of the Build Shift program for about 2 years now. I was a part of the first meeting, and one thing I did learn is a lot of knowledge within this group and a lot of expertise, and so it should be a fun group to be a part of.
Thanks, Derek. How about Jeanette? Are you here? Okay, maybe back to Misha. And how about Jimmy from Verde? Okay, well, we have 3 Build Shift team members here, and I want to share that we bring a lot of expertise and lived experience, but also generally within climate justice, with buildings and energy and equity. And so I think the Build Shift team members here today, we are a team of about 13 folks. We have more representation in the tenant working group, but thank you for being here today, both Derek and Taryn. I'll turn it, is that, actually, am I not turning it over? Oh, it's back to me, isn't it?
It's you,
All
Ben.
right, okay, why don't I start my presentation? Looking at a run of show off to the side here too. Okay, so I'll kick us off here with Zack Hart, who you met last time from the Institute of Market Transformation. Okay, so share screen here, and Zack, I'll advance your slides for you. All right, how's that looking? Okay, meeting number 2. So we are going to focus today on equitable energy and a bit on anti-displacement as it relates to equitable energy. And there are other parts of the Hart standards that we'll consider, like health, resilience, and temperature at the next meeting. So just to ground ourselves again, we're looking at the intersection of advancing racial equity and reducing carbon emissions. Those are the two goals that were outlined in the kind of beginning of this work with Build Shift. So at the city, we see that there are two major pathways to building decarbonization. One is increasing the renewable energy of electricity and natural gas in the supply, and then also reducing energy use. And so energy efficiency is one way to get there, but also energy conservation. And I want to thank the folks I met with at SEIU who noted that energy conservation can actually make a big difference, like through their Green Janitors program, of like turning lights off at night, for example. Now, one other thing I want to note here too is that the city of Portland can regulate carbon emissions, and some other cities that were shared last meeting, they can also regulate energy. We are not allowed to do that because we are preempted by the state. Meaning the city of Portland is preempted by the state of Oregon through its building code. Now we're focused on existing buildings, but whenever an existing building takes out a permit, it then triggers the building energy code, which then preempts us. So we can't regulate energy directly. So we are talking about carbon emissions. There are these other pathways to reducing carbon emissions that are focused on energy. So I want to clarify that a little bit. Happy to come back to that later too, if you have more questions. So one thing that I mentioned before too is that we have a model that we created with Architecture 2030. This is a ground up model of all the buildings in Portland. And then we looked at that, the energy use, and really projected that out to the year 2050 as part of our planning for a net zero carbon future. And so what you're seeing here on the left is building energy use trends. This model was built, the baseline is 2017. So we looked at the energy use in 2017 for all the buildings, and then extrapolated out to 2050. So there's some demolition that was assumed along the way. And then we looked at the growth trend that we expect based on the city's comprehensive plan that's also managed out of my bureau. And so the blue here is the growth that we expect to see. So the new construction is actually very small, especially early on compared to the existing buildings. And that's one of the reasons why we're so focused on existing buildings within this meeting. The other thing of note here is if we break it down by sectors, we see that multifamily on the right here, multifamily residential and commercial buildings is where we expect to see the most growth. Now, this graph is looking at the carbon emissions trend out to the future. So I'll note that this graph was actually created before the 100% renewable electricity legislation that passed last year. So HB 2021 House Bill. But what we saw back then is what the state renewable portfolio standard requires the electric utilities to reduce their carbon emissions by 50% by the year 2040. And so what this trend that you're looking at here is the same thing. The gray existing buildings electricity use is mostly dropping because of that. And then the new construction also is affected by that requirement from the state renewable portfolio standard. Now that standard brings us to zero emissions by 2040. So but the dotted line here basically shows what that would look like then based on that new legislation. So what that means, we still have further to go. We can't simply just rely on the state to get us to where we need to go in Portland. So I wanted to share a little bit before, just ground ourselves in some basic understanding of, before we jump into discussions around renewable energy, but what is our current electricity grid mix? So right now, it's partially renewable, mostly because of hydro. So I'm looking on the right side first. So the types of renewable supply that we have right now, the sources are hydropower, wind. The other is mostly solar. Natural gas, I will point out, is not currently renewable, but there is the potential for renewable natural gas in the future. Coal is not renewable. So one of the ways we look at that is the Columbia Boulevard wastewater treatment plant for the city currently supplies about 1% renewable natural gas into the mix through Northwest Natural. On the left side, you can see what our fuel mix is for the buildings. And so it's mostly electricity. You can see it's a good portion is natural gas. And then we look at the greenhouse gas emissions because we are still so coal and natural gas based. And there is a loss of of energy along the transmission of lines. You can see the greenhouse gas emissions in the lower left-hand corner here of the donut, or essentially it's a pie chart with the hole cut out in the middle, that it's mostly electricity is our focus. So when we see the state move towards that 100% renewable electricity, we're going to see a large drop in the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. Okay, and then just teeing us up a little more here, a couple other goals that not everybody might be aware of. The 100% renewable energy resolution that we have in 2017 sets a goal of 100% renewable electricity by 2035. That is now advanced to 2030 through the Climate Emergency Declaration. And then we have for all energy, whether it's heating, transportation, or electricity, it's to be 100% renewable by 2050. So that is the goal of why we're trying to get to zero carbon emissions. Within there's also 2% community-based energy by 2035. So that also is 2% of all the heating, transportation, energy use, and electricity use to come from the development of community-based energy, like community solar. By 2050, our goal is 10%. So it's a significant amount of local community-based energy that we are targeting. So I want to tee that up for our discussions too that are coming up. And then lastly here, just a list of renewable energy sources. I've already spoke to most of these. There's one extra here, renewable hydrogen. It can be produced out of hydropower, wind, or solar to create a hydrogen basically separated from water and then supplied as a fuel. So it's the separation happens through other electricity sources. There's also renewable natural gas that can be produced in the same way, but natural gas can also be produced by our own poop, for instance, not to be too graphic, but that is what's happening right now. We flush and it goes to the wastewater treatment plant. Part of that comes back out as methane that now is entering back into our system as renewable natural gas. Another source is potentially for RNG, or renewable natural gas, is biomass. So this can be waste wood. It can also be our own trees. So I'll point that out as well. I think when we look at biomass right now, that is not as much on the table because we don't necessarily want to cut down our trees to reduce our emissions, because they are actually a way to sequester carbon dioxide. They're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and helping us. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to two case studies of building performance standards. We're going to jump into this more, but Zack is going to provide an overview of two cities, the tale of two cities and their building performance standards that have already been enacted and they're in the process of implementation within Boston and Denver. Zack.
Yeah, thank you, Vin. Hi, nice to see everyone again. Zack Hart, Institute for Market Transformation. I also am joined by my colleague, Cliff Majerzik, who wasn't able to join us last meeting, but between the two of us, we've worked with about half of the jurisdictions, maybe a little more, that have done building performance standards. So Cliff will be available to help answer questions. So anyway, to get to these two case studies. So today, Vin's asked me to show you how the cities of Boston and Denver have set up their building performance standards. We're going to look at the structure of their policies a little later, but before, we'll do a quick overview of how those two cities are treating renewable energy in their building performance standards. So Boston has a building performance standard that applies to buildings 20,000 square feet and greater, and they'll be measured on their greenhouse gas emissions. So their CO2 equivalent emissions, they need to hit a standard there. To get there, they can either invest in energy efficiency or they can invest in renewable energy. And the forms of renewable energy that would count towards the standard in Boston are up here on the screen. So on-site renewable energy. So you put solar on your rooftop, you can count that towards your emissions limits to meeting the standard. There's also qualifying off-site renewable energy that Boston allows. So a building owner that is participating in Boston's Community Choice Electricity Program, or that buys renewable energy certificates from non-emitting renewable sources that meets the qualifications of the Massachusetts Renewable Portfolio Standard. Those will be accepted and counted against your your standard. And then power purchase agreements for renewable energy also count toward the standard. So you essentially have kind of two main strategies, right? Energy efficiency in your building, going out and investing in renewable energy, either on site or via one of these qualifying off-site renewable strategies. So Denver's policy is different in that they're measuring buildings against their site energy use intensity. So that's the energy that they use on a per square foot basis in their buildings. That said, they're still giving building owners that kind of two strategies for compliance. Energy efficiency obviously is one, improving the building's performance, or investing in renewable energy. So in Denver, what they're counting as renewable energy is only solar. And they're looking at, like Boston, on-site and off-site solar. So for on-site solar on the roof, they will count the kilowatt hours generated each year and subtract that from the building's electricity use. Therefore counting it towards the building's compliance with the performance standard. You also need to submit some proof of installation to make sure that solar is actually on your roof. You can also invest in offsite solar if it meets the following two conditions. It either needs to be owned by the building owner outright, in which case the owner just needs to have proof of ownership submitted to the city to prove that they own that solar installation. Or if it's owned by a third party, then the building owner needs to show evidence that they're subscribed to or leasing or purchasing a share in either a renewable energy program, which is offered by Xcel Energy, that's the utility serving Denver, or a community solar project located within the state of Colorado. So it has to be a local, more or less, a statewide, there's a state geographic limit to the third-party solar programs that you can subscribe to. But if you can show evidence that you're participating in that, they will, like on-site solar, subtract that from your building's energy use intensity.
Great, thank you, Zach. And next up, we have hearing from utilities about where their energy system sources are going in the future in terms of renewable energy. And I know that Nina, are you still on? I know that you needed to leave about now. Okay, well, I will share that Destination Zero is the Northwest Natural program that is available online. If you're a natural gas company or a natural gas company customer, then you have likely received a mailing on their plans. And so we can revisit this when Nina is back next. So I will turn it over to PG. Would you like to introduce yourself maybe just real quick, and then share where PG is headed in the future in terms of renewable energy?
Hi, this is Tess Jordan. I'm with PGE with our customer initiatives group. So I was given the direction that you wanted to touch base on state RPS, PGE's renewable energy plans, and then what we're doing to support our city's individual climate action plans.
Yes.
Okay, so big picture framework. I know we have a lot of different people with different backgrounds on the call. Renewable portfolio standards was our existing framework for how we go after clean energy in this state and in most states in the nation. And it defines the share of a population's energy that must be met with renewable resources. So it's a state level legislative tool that's been around for about 20 years. And Oregon first adopted that 2007, and then in 2016 updated it so that now our target is 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2050. So that's been our clean energy North Star for the last 5 years or so. And then last year, Oregon saw an enormous amount of successful environmental legislation, including House Bill 2021, which established more aggressive clean energy mandates. And they use a different framework of greenhouse gas emissions So an emissions framework is kind of saying yes to everything that is non-emitting and no to everything that is emitting. And the big differences between these frameworks are hydropower, which the Pacific Northwest is very rich in. So legacy dams, larger dams don't count towards RPS, but they do count towards greenhouse gas emissions reporting. And then biomass is emitting, is included in RPS, but will be phased out of the generation that is serving Oregon's load by 2040. So PGE's clean energy planning actually parallels the emissions reductions framework. We rolled out those ambitions just under a year ahead of that legislation, but passing that legislation on the state level means that all of Oregon's energy providers now have to meet those mandates, and it makes the transition easier because we now have this policy backing for the investment that it will require. So our current clean energy North Star is represented in this slide here. And that is on the pie chart on the left. This is kind of the emissions profile or the sources that serve our electric load today. The second pie chart is where we will be in 2030, which is that 80% of the electricity generated will be non-emitting. And by 2040, 100% of the electricity generated will be non-emitting. And that first pie chart looks different from the one that Vin presented earlier. And I'm thinking that is because Portland is in the fun position of being served by two utilities with different grids and system mixes. And so Portland's reporting is always this hybrid between PGE and PAC Power. So this pie chart shows that in 2022 for PGE, we were at about 40% non-emitting. So we have to go from 40% non-emitting to 80% within the next 8 years, and then eliminate all remaining emissions over the next decade. So this, to contrast this with the city's goals, the city has a 2030 rather than a 2045, 100% clean vision. And that vision is defined as renewable, which excludes hydro. So different resources that are being targeted and a faster time frame to get there. And one of the primary ways that PGE is will support Portland and other cities in our service territory with climate action resolutions that are similar is through this community supported renewables new program offering. This was also a part of the 2020 legislative session and its fruits. And that allows for the utilities to partner with local governments to develop a program to bring new renewable resources to the grid, supported by that community's households and small businesses, and to define what that energy mix should look like. It can include large-scale resources and also community-based resources. And that is a project that we are kind of just getting our hands dirty with to talk with our partner cities about what the nuts and bolts of that program should look like. And then what kind of an individual city-specific solution should look like within that program. That's it. Then you're on mute.
Thank you, Tess. Appreciate you sharing the background where PG is headed. This is good. So next up we have Pacific Power.
Hello, everyone. Good to meet you. I'm Alex Osteen, and I'm representing Pacific Power today. I'm on our customer and community solutions team. So quick reminder is that Pacific Power is a division of Pacific Corp that serves Oregon, Washington, and California. And we've got about 600,000 customers in the state of Oregon, about 80,000 of which live and work in the city of Portland, specifically the north side and parts of downtown. Next slide, please, Vin. Pacific Corp is on a path to clean energy, much like PGE is. In our 2021 Integrated Resources Plan, or IRP, we laid out this trajectory that will get us to around 88% non-emitting by 2040. That IRP plan prioritized bringing new non-emitting resources onto our grid, as well as retiring emitting resources like coal and natural gas. In addition to switching out those resources, our IRP is tasked with balancing costs and reliability. So on the left, you see our orange line of non-emitting resources going up through the years. And on the right, in the blue line, you see our emissions going down through the years. Next slide, please. My last slide. We wanted to zoom in on the resources that make up our path to non-emissions. You can see large chunks of energy efficiency here in the green, as well as wind resources in blue and solar plus storage in orange. Some of our biggest non-emitting resources from our IRP. But like PGE just mentioned, and like Vin mentioned, at the same time that Pacific Power was rolling out our IRP last year, the state passed House Bill 2021, which ratcheted up the goals for non-emissions. So Pacific Power went from being on a path to around 90% non-emitting by 2040, now to 100% non-emitting by 2040. That law also set up advisory groups that are focused on how we make that transition to clean energy equitable, as well as benefiting to all of our customer types. Finally, I wanted to mention one last piece is that Pacific Power works with communities and cities across our service territory who want to go faster towards non-emissions. And the city of Portland is a wonderful example. So this year, we are rolling out our program for community green tariffs for cities and also large customers who want to purchase RECs, renewable energy credits, or other sources faster. In addition to that program, we offer a number of other customer programs that are geared towards renewables, as well as assistance for low-income customers. And I put a link to our webpage that shows a lot more details of our IRP. And there's also a way to get involved in the stakeholder process there. I'll turn it back to you, Ben. Thank you.
All right, Alex, great to see where the direction y'all are headed as well. And then I wanted to come back to Northwest Natural. Kevin, would you like to share a couple minutes on Northwest Natural's plans?
You bet. Thanks, Ben. What you see is a graphical representation of literally our Vision 2050. And I'll say up front, that vision is a carbon neutral future. So that might seem strange coming from a fossil fuel supplier, but I just want to say that while we're a fossil fuel supplier today, we're working hard to not be one in the future. So if you think about it, the molecules can come from any number of sources. And that's what this graphic is showing, exactly that. I don't have a pointer available, but I think you can see kind of in the middle of the chart there, the big band, the renewable natural gas that Ben mentioned earlier, that indeed is coming right now from the Columbia wastewater treatment plant, where we're working with other folks in the region to capture methane from wastewater treatment plants and from landfills, and outside the region from digesters, anaerobic digesters for wastewater. And in addition to that, we're seeing the opportunity for capturing excess renewable energy, and I'll say more about that in a second, but capturing that as hydrogen that can then be stored or used directly in any number of ways. It's a chemical feedstock, it's a transportation fuel, and a fuel for buildings as well. And when I say capture excess renewable energy, there are many times on the grid when there's far more solar or wind or even hydroelectric energy that can be used in that moment. You know, the grid has a small amount of storage inherent in it, but we're talking minutes, and that can be expanded with battery storage and other technologies to hours. But if you store a gas, you can do so for months, and this is already in play. We do this with natural gas now. We buy it when it's cheap in the summer and send it out in the winter when it's mostly used. So I know of a project, just as an example, in Washington, a dam, Douglas County. They realized that they had so much excess energy that they either had to dump water or pay to get rid of it, and that they could therefore convert that into hydrogen and sell it. And so it was advantageous for them and offset energy, obviously, and offset emissions in that process. And I think I saw a question about renewable energy and being carbon neutral, or how does that work? And
do you mind, Kevin? Like we need to get to our
okay.
discussion groups too.
Sorry.
But that will come up in terms of ranking. And so why don't we wrap up here with the background information, just going into your Q&A, or sorry, with your small breakouts. And I just want to acknowledge this is a technical topic right now. And
sure.
There are a lot of equity implications within this right now too. What is renewable energy? And we want to have some discussions, hear from each other too. And so we're going to build the knowledge together here.
Thanks for that time check, Ben.
So why don't we go ahead and move that direction? I think this is the next slide in the next part, second half of the presentation. So I'm going to start sharing so we can get into our breakout rooms.
Thank you.
And just to note this, so there's two big questions, and they're basically, so now we know that the utilities are headed in the right direction, but then what's our priority for our buildings? Which part of the renewables do we prefer? And so the questions are oriented in that direction. And it's not just about the source, where it's coming from for renewable energy, but also where is it located? So we want to hear some more feedback from that. So I'll transition back over to Marty and Irene to go into that.
Thanks, Vin. And thank you all for putting some really excellent questions into the chat. Go ahead and keep doing that, and we will make sure that we are able to answer those questions, if not like verbally at the beginning of next session, but perhaps by putting together some materials to share with you all on this, relatively esoteric topic. Okay, so we're going to do one thing before we go into breakout groups, but let me quickly tell you about the breakout groups. They're going to feel very familiar to you if you were here last week. There will be 5 breakout groups. Each group is going to have a facilitator. So you're either going to be with Vin, Andrea, Jacob, Dirk, Irene, or myself. And we're going to talk more about what the discussion questions are once you get into that group. But before we go into the groups, we wanted to talk a little bit about values. And so I wanted to ask Irene Kim, who you met earlier as the facilitator of the tenant working group, to come back up and lead us in a values exercise that she also did with that other working group.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and give you and start this polling exercise. So we did this with the tenant working group, and this is also done by in the kickoff meeting many months ago with stakeholders. And I just wanted to share sort of the wordle that came out of the question around any kind of personal values that from the community that they would want to bring to these Hart standards. So we wanted to ask you all the same question and kind of start with values. So you might already be familiar with this, but let me going to give you some instruction. So Wing's gonna put in this So I will take you what you're seeing on screen here. So that'll pop in the chat box. If you can click on that link, and you should see what you're seeing on this shared screen. And if that's not working for you, you can also just go to www.menti.com and use this code up here, 101029992, and join that way as well. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to our exercise. And thank Hart.
Irene, your voice is
that we want to pose
off
to you as well, and we did this with. Okay, sorry about that. So ask you all in the asking group is what values are important to bring to the Hart standards. So you should be able to, you should be seeing 3 kind of boxes to enter your responses here. And you'll kind of see them pop up live as folks are entering their responses. So we'll give you all maybe about a minute or 2 here to start entering your responses and see what you all come up with in terms of what values are important to bring to the Hart standards.
I want to ask if anybody is having any challenges getting into the Menti, you can go ahead and message me, Marty, or yeah, why don't you message me if you need any support getting into this this web-based tool.
Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of commonalities around equity, health, sustainability, sequestration. So the larger the text, the more entries that that you all are putting into this. I think justice, resilience. Great. Some other things that I'm seeing here: future generations, transparency, neighborhoods. Great. Commitment to equity. Low barrier solutions. Good. Seeing community safety pop up, access, fairness. Great. So I'll give you another maybe 10 more seconds to add in your final sort of values here. Families is coming up, timely reductions. Urgency. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on since we're a little short on time. But thank you all for your participation in this. And before I move on, I want to bring it to back to Marty. I wanted to share the wordle that the tenant working group came up with, and it's very, very similar, which is great to see. So this is what the tenant working group values came up with. So again, equity, health, community, affordability, justice, a lot of the same values that are popping up, which is great. Okay, I'll turn it back to Marty. Thanks for participating.
Thanks, Irene. And I'm just going to hand it right back off again to Vin to give us a reminder of the BPS ground rules for the discussions we're about to go into.
All right, thank you, Marty, and thank you everybody for participating in that. I did drop the ground rules in the chat. Just as a reminder that we do have ground rules, please read through those for a minute here. And then just wanted to share a bit on why we started with values. And this is something that I learned through working with the Build Shift team, as we really wanted to center Black and Brown communities at the beginning of a policy process. I had to learn what different ways of entering meetings myself. And I think grounding ourselves in values is one of the most valuable tools that that I've gone through with the Build Shift team. So I want to thank them for bringing that into our own public processes here. Let's get a sense for what everybody's bringing to the table, what our common values are, or uncommon values. Yeah, so I think next up is we're going to go into our breakout rooms. So there might be more questions than answers on renewable energy, but let's hear from each other and kind of work in that collective knowledge as we build a base together here. And do encourage everybody to participate as best you can. We will go through 2 questions, and we're running a little bit behind time, but we should have 20 minutes. So Wing, that would put us back at 1:15, coming back into the report out. And so Wing, you all set to send us over to our breakout rooms?
Oh, well.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. If you got cut off in your final thoughts the way Kevin did in our group, I'm going to apologize to you on behalf of our timeline and the fact that Zoom is not super polite when it pulls you out of your groups. Wait just a minute for everybody to get back. I still see people popping back in.
So I also want to apologize. We were running 5 behind, and Wing and I had a miscommunication of where we coming back at 1:15 as in our internal run of show, or 1:20, and I didn't catch it fast enough. So my apologies for those who didn't get to speak, specifically Amanda Ingmeyer from DEQ in our group.
We will have a second opportunity to share thoughts. We're going to go when we do our second breakout group, you're going to be in the same, hopefully if everything works right, you're going to be in the same groups. Okay, so we have a chance to kind of pick up where we left off, but we really want to make sure that we get a 5-minute break in and give everybody a chance to kind of refresh and regroup. And so what we'd like to do is do a quick report out so that we can all get a sense of what was going on in the groups that we were not in. And so I'm going to ask each of the facilitators to just give us like a 1-minute highlight on what some of the themes were in the groups that you led. So Vin, would you go first?
Sure. So one thing I heard was safety, and especially moving hydrogen within a natural gas system. I heard resilience in multiple places. So being without power during a recent storm and having a natural gas fireplace to help, but also valuing solar and wind. And within resilience also is both heat and power, to have that as backup. There is a concern shared about older buildings, especially apartment buildings, that don't have the electrical systems necessary for on-site renewable energy, and that there's a cost concern within that. And one, just noting that all the sources have their problems, that there is no perfect solution. And then to wrap up in the second question, more about location, is assuring that the full benefit of clean energy is be taken advantage of locally, and be considering how far away do we need to bring that power, and do we need to store it? That's it.
Thanks, Vin. Andrea, will you tell us about your group?
Sure. I will just say that I heard some of the same things that Vin just mentioned, so I'll try to focus on the things that weren't said. There are definitely concerns about what would be less disruptive to tenants, like if we're making upgrades to buildings that have tenants in them. Things around weather and reliability, around some of the renewables, and competing priorities in large institutions that have big goals, but a lot of limited funds and need to balance among a lot of competing priorities. An important point around some disincentive in the billing structure that is a barrier for some landlords to do this work, because there's no real way for them to recoup on and do rebilling. So we want to dig into that a little more. Concerns about RNG and renewable hydrogen in terms of cost and affordability and availability, and their impact on rates. And then the value of behind the meter resources as compared to front of the meter. It's mostly what I heard.
You guys are doing great. You're talking almost faster than I can type. Irene, what about your group?
Yeah, so one thing that we talked about was the need for certainty. We talked a lot about what the other groups talked about, but one thing that was different was a need for certainty. So it's great to have goals and aspirations, but it's another to have sort of requirements and mandates to meet our goals. And that was something that came up. And also just that it seems like that things are moving fast, but and change is hard, but there's communities that need to catch up and need to kind of look at the impacts on, especially on Indigenous and BIPOC communities, and need to look at those impacts really carefully. So I'm very appreciative to be at the table here and be part of the conversation. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Irene. Dirk, what about your group?
Well, I think most of the things have been said, but I'll add that I heard surprised that energy efficiency was not on the list, but how important that is and should come in front of other things like renewable energy, reduction of waste and how to turn it into energy, rehabbing existing buildings, equity and affordability, and concern around Native Americans' concerns of hydropower generation. Who's being impacted by affordability, environmental impacts are important to those equity concerns. Making sure renewable energy has good qualifications, i.e. geographic boundaries outside solar or not just any renewable. How buildings and workers are harnessed to reduce those emissions. Clarification about hydro, how much are somebody had a question about clarification of hydro and how much we're relying on dams. There was definitely a preference for community-based energy, and resiliency factor goes up with community solar and how that helps support community renewable hubs. Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk. So definitely hard to go last, but I would also say that our group had a lot of the same conversations as you all. A couple of other things that we talked a bit about were, how do you know what a truly green renewable energy source is? Are there things that are being greenwashed or maybe not being lifted up, and concerns about knowing what we're buying when we're buying it? We also talked about the just the critical nature of the cost of renewables, and I think we talked about that from a business perspective and also from a household perspective, and this idea that higher cost renewables are going to be harder for people to justify on both fronts, and that also creates an equity issue in who has access to them. So I'm going to leave it at that from our group, and I would like to give us all a 5-minute break. So we're going to come back let's do an even number. We're going to come back at 1:28. So I'll invite you to turn off your video, turn off your mic, and rejoin us at 1:28. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We'll just wait 30 seconds for everybody to pop back in. Okay, so I hope you all feel refreshed after that micro break. So we're going to move now into the second major piece of our agenda. And this is on carbon standards and energy efficiency, right? So energy efficiency already came up as a topic kind of in concert with renewable energy. So here's where we can really give it its full due. So I will turn the floor over to Vin to introduce the presentations.
Great, thank you, Marty. Yeah, so we're going to hear from the Energy Trust of Oregon on some of their programs and where they're headed next in terms of energy efficiency and incentives for those types of improvements. And then we have a short inspirational video of a project here in town and highlighting several property owners here from Better Bricks. And then we will have additional background on this policy structure. So we're going to go back to something kind of a technical subject again that Zack and I will cover, mostly Zack this time. And we'll have some breakout questions around the carbon emissions standards and just two questions again. If there is time, we could revisit the end of the last question. I know we're some of us had a little bit of a shortened time there at the second question of the first group. But we will be in the same group, so we'll have to go through introductions again. Okay, so Wendy, are you all set?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share my slides.
Okay, great. Wayne, could you make Wendy co-host? Or whatever she needs to share her screen.
Got it. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, great, okay.
I'm seeing your slides, your stack on the left too.
Yes, that's perfect, that's fine. I actually find it's easier to do it this way than actually present the actual slide deck when in Zoom, so hopefully that's okay for everybody else. So I think most of you probably know who Energy Trust is, but just to level set, we're a nonprofit that was created through the state legislature about 20-ish so years ago. We serve 5 utilities, which are Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, Northwest Natural, Cascade Natural Gas, and Avista. Today, we're really just focused on the Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, and Northwest Natural side of things. And I wanted to start just by level setting what our 5-year strategic plan is. And so our 5-year strategic plan goes through 2024. And our number one thing is to engage customers, specifically to engage with customers that we have traditionally excluded, which I'll get to here in just a minute. So one of the things that Vin asked me to talk about briefly was just Energy Trust shift in funding. And this was a previous slide I had, which kind of goes through the history of how Energy Trust was created and the funding shift. So in short, up until this year, we were funded by the public purpose charge. There is still a small portion of Energy Trust of Oregon that is funded by the public purpose charge. However, in the last state legislature session, the public purpose charge was reduced from 3% to 1.5%, and it actually eliminated most of the funding for Energy Trust of Oregon, with the requirement that Energy Trust of Oregon work with the utilities that we provide in or get energy efficiency savings in order to actually work with them to create tariffs. So now we're funded through tariffs as opposed to the public purpose charge for the most part, except for some small carve-outs around low income and solar. So that's kind of how our funding is shifting. This year is the first year that we're doing that. And so we're figuring it out as we go. I am not the one figuring it out, so I don't have a lot of information, but I can answer questions, get questions answered if you have them. So one of the things that Vin also wanted me to talk about was kind of what's been happening in the commercial and multifamily sectors, at least from our standpoint around energy efficiency and Energy Trust of Oregon. So these are pretty dynamic graphs, but it just really points out. So each color is a market sector, and I've highlighted the main market sectors. So you can kind of see over time, both from an electric saving standpoint and a natural gas saving standpoint, what market sectors have helped contribute the most savings to our goals. And so you can see that, street lighting for the most part stays pretty high when it comes to electric savings. But you can also see multifamily on there, which is great. This includes both owner-occupied, rental, affordable, and non-affordable, or market rate rather. And you can kind of see kind of what sectors in the Portland metro area really contribute to energy savings. And we're continuing to see that come through over time. And we expect that to stay relatively the same. All right, so the Portland multifamily market savings trends, one again is electric, the other is natural gas, which is really just to show that over time we saw a really big need for the multifamily space to be focused on. So Energy Trust of Oregon explicitly pulled out multifamily into its own program. There was a lot of great work done. There has been a lot of great work in the multifamily side. That became a less cost-effective program for us. So we rolled it up underneath existing buildings, which allows it to be more cost-effective from a delivery standpoint. And so what we see here is kind of the savings decreasing over time. However, we do expect that hopefully a flat line over the course of the next couple of years. And you'll note that the majority of our multifamily sites are obviously rental as opposed to owner occupied. That blue dot kind of indicates kind of the difference between both rental and owner occupied, and then just the rental. So our rental multifamily is really the bulk of where we get our savings, which is great. Portland energy efficiency trends. This is just highlighting the measures or the products that we normally see that people are installing. So from a commercial standpoint, it's lighting, HVAC, and weatherization. Weatherization overcame just some kind of other categories, just kind of a smattering of things that don't rise to the top. We think weatherization probably overcame as one of the largest measures implemented because we had a really strong insulation bonus a couple of years ago that really helped weatherize a lot of locations, specifically K through 12 schools. So what we know, Energy Trust of Oregon has disproportionately excluded small businesses, BIPOC communities, and rural communities over time. That is where we're headed. That is what we're focusing on over the last couple of years. We also know that as federal and state standards increase, finding measures to incentivize means that we need to be more innovative in the way in which we can incentivize measures and offerings. We also know that more collaboration and communication with stakeholders and community members will be needed moving forward, from program design to budgeting, which we're currently working on. And then current market trends between local, national, and international changes in the economy, wars, globalization, all these different things have really affected both the ability to implement energy efficiency, but also they've created opportunities that we didn't anticipate. For instance, during the pandemic, a lot of government agencies, municipalities, and K through 12 took that opportunity of places not being occupied to actually push through a lot of really great work that got done. We didn't expect to see that. We thought we were going to see a lot of grinding halt of measures, but we actually saw a lot of great work pushing forward. We also expect a lot of the federal funding coming down to be able to push into energy efficiency as well, along with some of the support we're getting for the extreme heating and cooling we're seeing should be able to support some of our energy efficiency objectives as well. So what's happening in existing buildings? We're starting to kind of increase our incentives for gas energy efficiency measures being implemented. We also launched a small business offering, which is a small business is defined as having 20 employees or 20,000 square feet or less, or a community service provider. So this includes basically anybody supporting communities that we have traditionally excluded. So providing like community service spaces, or for instance, severe weather shelters, we're going to be actually providing increased incentives for those communities. We also have something called our contractor development pathway, which is focusing on diverse contractors and educating them on energy efficiency, and then giving them kind of a closed trade ally network to be able to actually do some projects, which is exciting. And then we're also looking at ways that we can do co-funding and complementary funding to kind of bridge that gap between our incentives, and the full cost of the project. And so we're continuing to identify ways that we can partner with organizations that already have funding. And then community partner funding is, we're actually looking to go out with community-based organizations to help grow their capacity to implement things like ducted and ductless heat pumps. We also have an affordable multifamily strategic energy management cohort that has just launched. And one of the things that I think is really great that's specific to the existing buildings program is we have an advisory body of community-based liaisons, which are helping to do things like an equity assessment, perform community engagement, do restorative justice healing circles. And also they are starting to specifically integrate within different departments of our programs, such as engineering or outreach, to actually help bring community voice to the forefront. And that's my presentation. Hopefully I stayed within the time frame, Vin.
You did, thank you. And thank you for sharing the Energy Trust work. And, since we last worked together at BPS over a decade together now, it's great to see the work that you have accomplished, especially with the Energy Trust. And I really love to see the focus on low income and community-based organizations and services there. It's good to know that that's the direction you are headed. Okay, so I would like to cover a little more about what the performance standards are going to be. There is an inspirational video connected to what Wendy had just been mentioning about the Energy Trust work. It's short, so why don't we go ahead and get that going here, Wing, if you could start that video. And it's from Better Bricks, another partner with the city for a long time through the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. I don't think we have audio. Yep, still no audio. Since the audio is not working, Wayne, could you drop the link in the chat and then we'll go on to the next part. I'll start teeing that up.
Very strange. Sorry about that.
No worries, that happens sometimes. Zoom. All right. But yeah, I do encourage you all to take a look, especially if you're wondering, like, what does a deep energy retrofit look like? The case study there is the Lloyd 700 building. And Wing, if you could drop that case study in the chat too, of really the business case for making deep energy retrofits into existing commercial office buildings. All right. So let me come back here. Okay, so the next part we're looking at, so we cover renewable energy as a pathway and then energy efficiency as a pathway to building decarbonization. And the next place that I'd like to bring us back together is, so how can carbon emission performance standards get us there to our goals, by really kind of encouraging both of those paths. So some brief background here. I know that there are some questions, I think, around this last time. So just change my display setting here. So City of Portland does have a climate emergency declaration. We are in an emergency. I think anybody who's been here since 2020 knows that, that we're what we've been experiencing, and covered that in last meeting as well. And so we already have goals. And fortunately, Portland is already doing a lot of work here. And we have goals that are to really get ourselves off of fossil fuels and address climate change. It's happening across the world too. It's not just Portland. So our goal is 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So net zero means that it's the amount of emissions that we produce are actually being sequestered, like I was mentioning before, like the forest taking those emissions out. So over the course of the year, the overall impact is zero emissions. Carbon emissions, I wanted to clarify that we refer to carbon emissions often because that's what's in the common vernacular on greenhouse gas emissions. It's become carbon emissions, but what we really mean is greenhouse gas emissions and their carbon dioxide equivalency. So I'm listing the number of major greenhouse gases here: carbon dioxide, methane, which is 25 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And then natural gas, I think most of you know, its chemical name is methane. And then nitrous oxide, 265 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And it's also, all three of these are fossil fuel combustion products. And fluorinated refrigerants, 10,000 times more global warming potential than carbon dioxide, and also currently still used in some heat pumps that we have out there. And so we were talking about heat pumps earlier. There is a gas that we don't want to escape. The system's designed not to let it escape, but sometimes they do leak, like if you've ever had an old car with an air conditioner that needs to be recharged. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these, but I wanted to give you a sense of the cities that do have building performance standards. Most of them look at energy use. And we, as I mentioned earlier, we have to look at only at carbon emissions, or in the definition, greenhouse gases. So, and that's because of state preemption. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at energy at all. So part of the next questions will be around energy metrics. And there's value, I think, in looking at additional metrics in there, like what are the energy costs that someone might expect, whether it's a residential or commercial tenant. So I'm just noting that on the left column here are some of the energy metrics that other cities use. And then some of the equity considerations here too, and just thinking of those intersections then with reducing fossil fuels. And it's not just about energy burden, but also there's opportunities, as we've seen in some other cities, to really advance equity through standards like these. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Zack to go back to our tale of two cities and jump into two different policy structures that are similar, both get to the same target of zero carbon emissions, but have a slightly different path to get there. And then we'll have some discussion about that, as well as the metrics that might be helpful from these standards. Zack, are you all ready?
Yes, thanks, Vin. So first we're going to look at Boston's building performance standard, which they adopted in 2021. So Boston, like Vin said, uses greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 equivalent, as the performance metric that they set building performance standards for. So what you're looking at here is a chart of the emissions limits for different types of buildings in the different time periods covered by the law. So that you can see in one column, 2025 to 2029, those are the CO2 emissions, or CO2 equivalent emissions limits for the various building types covered by the law, right? And then those limits get more stringent every 5 years out to 2050, at which point they zero out for everybody. So that's really the main structure of the law. There's, we have different building use types. There is a standard every 5 years for each type that every building in that type needs to meet, and it gets stricter until 2050 and we zero out. Next slide, please. So I wanted to make it kind of easy to understand what that looks like in practice. So I made this very simple chart to try to illustrate that. So imagine we're looking at 3 office buildings in Boston here, office A, B, and C. And what I've got charted here is each of those buildings' emissions intensity. So this is the greenhouse gases per square foot that these buildings emit on the y-axis. So then if you click the mouse, we'll do the first animation here. So here's the limit for 2025, which for offices is about 5 kilograms CO2 equivalent per square foot. So in 2025, you can see office A has to do quite a bit of improvement to meet that standard. They need to reduce by essentially 7 kilograms per square foot. If you look at office building B and office building C, they're below the standard. They're below the limit. They don't have to do anything up to that 2025 to 2029 standard. They just need to basically remain below that red line. Click again, please, Vin. And so in 2030, the limit gets lower, right? So now we're somewhere around 3. And now office A needs to basically to continue to reduce. So, let's say they made it to about 5 kilograms per square foot in 2025. Now they need to reduce a further 2, roughly, to hit the 2030 limit. Building B now has to reduce its emissions intensity to hit that 2030 limit because its performance is over the line. Office building C is still still fine. They're a good performer. And click one more time, please. Right. So now all the buildings are going to have to reduce. So Office A and Office B have to go a little bit farther to hit the limit. And Office C has now been affected by the law. They need to shave off a little bit of their emissions intensity to meet the standard. Hopefully that's clear. So one thing that I just want to point out here is that we're just looking at 3 hypothetical buildings. Obviously, there's a lot of office buildings in Boston. Now, a large number of them will have to start making improvements pretty much immediately to hit those 2025 limits. But the buildings that are very poor performers have to make really big improvements in their performance in a short number of years to hit that 2025 limit, whereas the better performers don't have to do anything until later years. So I think that's something to really consider when you're thinking about this policy structure. Is how are those poor performing buildings going to meet that initial standard? It could be quite a big investment for a lot of them to hit. So that's kind of the key consideration for this approach. Next slide, please, Vin. Okay, so now we're going to look at Denver's policy and the way that it is structured. Next slide. So they use what IMT calls the trajectory approach. This is the method. I actually previewed this for the group in our last meeting. Denver uses this structure, and Montgomery County, Maryland, some of you may have heard, adopted a building performance standard just last week. So they also use the trajectory approach that we're looking at here today. Now, unlike Boston, Denver's policy uses site energy use intensity. So rather than greenhouse gas emissions intensity, we're looking at their site energy use per square foot. So a different metric, but that's, as far as looking at the structure of the policy, it doesn't really change anything. So this is different in that we're not looking at absolute limits for the amount of energy or carbon your building can produce. Or use or emit, I should say. We're looking at a final absolute standard out into the future that every building within a building type has to hit. So we're, again, looking at office buildings, just like in Boston, and looking at 3 hypothetical examples, Office A, Office B, and Office C. They're all responsible for hitting the same final standard in Denver in the year 2030 of about 50 for an EUI for offices. But each building, rather than having to hit an absolute standard in each interim period, so rather than having to hit kind of the same performance level in 2024, every building has its own performance trajectory, which is calculated by taking its baseline performance, drawing a line to the final standard, and then you can say, okay, in 2024, Office A needs to be at an 83. In 2024, Office B, which is a more efficient building than Office A, only needs to be at a 70, right? Because that's where it needs to perform if it's on this trajectory towards a final standard of 50 in 2030. And Office C, which is the better performer, just has to make a very minor improvement by 2024. They need to hit 57, which keeps them on their trajectory towards 50. So the idea here is that rather than having just the worst performers need to make improvements in that first compliance period, everyone needs to make some improvement, but that improvement is relative to where they start in the baseline year, right? So the poor performers, they still have to make their improvements faster than other buildings, but it's not as fast, right? That's attenuated by this longer slope down to the final standard. So everybody is moving, but you're not asking Office A to make a really big improvement in its first compliance period, the way you potentially are in the Boston model.
Great.
So I hope that's clear. I know
we'll find out. Why don't we?
I was going to just say
Q&A here. Yeah, thank you, Zach. Like, I'll just put this in my own terms for a minute. I think of like the absolute emission limits. It's a carbon cap that ratchets down and eventually gets everybody, but it's the worst performers that get caught first. Which also I think about equity in those terms. And so, are the worst performers also like the apartments that have had the least amount of investment? And then for the other one, I think about that it's almost the trajectory approach is like. That it's almost custom. Like everybody start where you're at and do better, but eventually we all got to get to zero, which is administratively sounds more challenging on my end of the city. So they both come with their challenges and their benefits. But why don't we open it up to some questions and answers here? We'll do our best to answer and see if people have questions before we go into breakouts. We'll talk about these two approaches in one question and then about metrics in the other. Marty, how are we doing for time too, by the way?
We're doing great on time. Yeah, we have time for Q&A.
All right.
So I have a question. So if between these two different models, if the goal right now, the IPCC is saying we need to get to a substantial reduction by 2025 in emissions, which of these models would help move us along that pathway, or where the kind of upfront emission reductions buys us time to figure out all of the other unknown questions that we have to figure out down the road? Which of these two models would work better in that framework?
And that's a great question. And Diana, would you just give your name and affiliation in case you got lost in people's jumble of boxes on their screen?
Diana Meisenhilter with the NAACP Environmental Justice.
Thanks, Diana. Zach and Vin, what do you think about that? Which one gives us the biggest like quantitative reductions the fastest, or in the first period?
Do you want me to go first, Zach?
Sure,
Ben. First. Okay. So what I think that either one, it's depending on where the limit is set. So in this case, the limit's set so it captures a lot of the worst performing buildings, and we could do an assessment of what is our goal for 2025 is probably too soon for Portland, but let's just say 5 years from now, where do we want to be? And it's I think about, well, there's a lot of low hanging fruit at those worst performing buildings too. So even though there's potential impacts on cost impacts, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, especially the rental market. So that I think that cap kind of pushes, it brings those the worst performing back into like being high performing, with implications of potential gentrification too, displacement. But in terms of, you're saying just to get to the carbon standards, I think it's where we set the limit, and there's a lot of potential there for the worst performing. In this case, there's also potential. It's where's the limit setting? So we could have everything ratchet down quickly. In this case, for Denver, their first interval is 2024. So it's really kind of where do we set that? And that's I think a discussion we should have some more here than the next meeting. I'm sorry, at the fourth meeting, and then continuing to have discussions too. But this, for now, I'd say that it's, thinking about who's impacted by how the limits are set. And do we meet everybody where they're at, and everybody move, or do we capture kind of the buildings that are lowest performing first? Does that help, Diane?
I'm not sure if it does or not.
Okay, Zach, take a shot.
No, I agree. It really depends on where you set these standards. I mean, you could do the Boston approach and just take all the worst performing buildings and say, hey, you got to get down here very fast, and that will have big savings. The issue there is, we have a lot of other things we care about. We want it to be achievable technically and economically. We certainly don't want to exacerbate any inequities. And as Vin said, there's a good chance that some of those poor performing buildings, might have lower resources. We might be putting those businesses in jeopardy, or the residents of those buildings in economic, it's some chance of economic harm there. So that's all to be considered. And I think with the Denver type approach, yes, you're saying to the poor performers, you have a more allowance to, in Portland's case, it would be to emit carbon. you have a steeper slope to get to the final, but you're allowed to use some more. However, you're making up some of that with the middle of the road performers who might not be covered under the initial, like say the first or second emissions limits. They're making improvements from day one, right? So you're capturing some savings there early rather than deferring that to later compliance periods. But I see a couple of hands up for this.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, I want to make sure we have a couple of minutes before we need to go into our small group. So David Heslam, if you want to go first, and then Sean, if you'd like to go next. And then I just want to make sure we have time. There was a question for Wendy Gibson that came into the chat. We'll do that one third. David, go ahead.
Sure, super quick. I guess I'm wondering, Vin and Zach, which of these systems you think might prevent building owners from making suboptimal short-term decisions that then lock them in, say, to equipment choice, right? That then makes it really hard for them to hit the future targets. And so that it gets into the metrics probably, and whether or not you're using current GHG metrics or the forecasted ones for 10 years out, because making a decision today based on what the emissions in the future might be will be different, right? We saw that with the forecast emissions versus current emissions. So I haven't studied this problem in that way, but I just know we don't want folks to, spend money on something to hit the next 3-year goal, and then that's going to make it tougher for them to hit the 15-year goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing I'll just point to before I turn over to Zach is that the performance standard goes all the way out to a 2050 goal of 0. So, but it has the flexibility. So that would be a bad decision for somebody to do a suboptimal system that just gets them to 3 years out, knowing that they have another one coming up right away. So this does say 50 for now, but the actual extension is to 0.
Unless they only plan to hold the building for 5 years.
That's a really good point.
Because most commercial property is always for sale, as they say.
Might drive down the value if folks know that, though, too. But maybe it's about making it disclosed. And so that gets back to metrics. But let's get there in the discussion, too. But Zach, do you have an initial response to that based on what you've seen in other cities?
So I would say, you want to give people long-term certainty. So both of these models are saying out to the future, like, here's where the standards are. Now, there's an added complicating factor with, how you account for the renewable grid. Like, greenhouse gas emissions is more complex than energy as a performance metric. So I think there are strategies we could talk about later about how to increase owner certainty about where, how the carbon intensity of electricity is going to be considered in the policy. But to your point about selling the building, I mean, if these standards go out to 2050 and everyone knows they're there, and people purchasing buildings are doing their due diligence, the city's made this clear that these are the requirements, owners are going to know, they're going to ask, hey, where's this building performing? They're going to look at benchmarking data to kind of evaluate a building and make sure that they're taking into consideration how it's performing relative to the standards.
And so can we take the question for Wendy? Because when we get into our breakout groups, if there are additional questions, Zach can bounce around and just let your facilitator know you have a question about what was presented here that will help inform your answer. And then Zach can be called into your room. So, but I want to make sure that the question for Wendy is answered while Wendy's here.
Sure. Wendy, the question came from Hal Nelson, who is asking if Energy Trust has a whole building multifamily retrofit program. And Hal was saying he didn't think that Energy Trust had one, but it seemed like that was the kind of program that would be really important to help multifamily buildings meet these climate and health standards. So Wendy, are you able to clarify kind of what you offer right now for multifamily buildings?
Yeah, we don't have that. And I chatted Hal on the side and told him that I'd get him more information, but I can get that information to the rest of the group as well. I know we're looking at some things. I just don't know what they are. I don't have the technical expertise. So I'm going to put him in touch with somebody that does, and I can make sure to give an answer for everybody. And while I'm not on mute, I'll also say one thing that I think is really interesting about these conversations we're having is we're not talking about the cost of climate change in the cost of the changes that need to be made. And I think if we're going to convince people to do this or get people on board, we have to talk about the consequences and the cost of not doing anything. And that's being wholly just not considered right now. And that's because we're talking about change, but what does it mean if we don't do anything, not just for the communities, but for the individual property owners, because that's what's really going to motivate them to get on board. Is it rising costs of, of electricity, the inability to keep occupants because you can't maintain heating or cooling, and how do you quantify that? And I think that's a conversation that if we're gonna talk about the cost of doing something, we have to talk about the cost of not doing something.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy.
I want to ask quickly to the two other folks with their hands up, Sean and Michael. I think it's important if your questions are for Zack and Vin or Wendy, and they're kind of clarifying questions or kind of similar to the things that were raised by NAACP and Earth Advantage that will kind of facilitate our small group discussions. I want to ask you to offer those now, and if not, want to ask you to kind of hold them for your small groups. That is a hard judgment call to make, right? Okay, okay, unfair. That was unfair.
So
Sean,
I think mine might add to the small group discussion, because that question, the issue of equity came up, and I wonder about a decision in a policy that looks at the potential for displacement of historically disadvantaged communities due to cost. But to use a solution of, so we're going to let those buildings be as bad as possible as long as possible, because that's what the trajectory approach, if it's custom, kind of effectively does. Instead of making the worst performers really improve early, it lets them spread it out over time. So I think it seems to me that maybe if equity is the concern, then rather than removing kind of the advantage of having their buildings improved, to address that issue in other ways, whether that's housing preservation or targeted incentives that can help offset the cost instead, because we see this.
You just froze for a second there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sean, I think that's more of a comment. So why don't we save that, continue that within the breakout group? Thank you.
Michael,
but it's an important comment. But if there's clarifying questions about the structures themselves, let's answer those.
So hopefully this is a clarifying question. I felt like the most interesting thing for me that was new in our last meeting was the notion of incrementally making improvements to buildings when the life cycle of the various parts of the building come due for replacement, whether it's your heating system or the skin of your building or other elements. And hopefully this doesn't sound like a comment, but is it fair to say that the incremental approach is a better fit if you're looking at the life cycle approach of elements of the building? Or am I just making that up, that concept works just as well with the hard standard approach or for all buildings?
Yeah, this is introductory level, and I think you point out something really important here, Michael. And there is a question, and that'll be like, is there another option? And so there is another option that other cities have had to look at for institutions like yours, as well as regulated affordable housing that's on very distinct financing cycles. And it's not a straight line. It matches their cycles line. So I think that a hybrid of some kind or some other approach, I think it will have room for that comment as well. But yeah, to answer your question, there is room for other approaches. So why don't we break out?
Okay, everybody, welcome back. Okay, this time in my group, it was me that got cut off, so I feel good about that, or I feel less bad about one of the group members getting cut off. So what I invited my group members to do, and I would invite you all, if there was something that you really wanted to contribute that you didn't get a chance to, go ahead and stick that into the chat. And if you, for any reason, like don't want to share it with the whole group, you can feel free to just send me a direct message, and then we'll export that and make sure it gets into the notes from today. Okay, I think we have everybody back. We're going to do, again, a very kind of lightning round of report out so we can hear what other groups talked about, and then we will close out for the day. So Vin, can I ask you to go first with a minute on your group's key themes?
Yeah, for sure. I'll note we didn't cover beyond the first question, so I'm hoping we can continue with the next question, not the next meeting, the one after that, meeting 4 on May 25th, where it's kind of similar discussion about metrics. But for what we did cover in question 3 and the structures, there were some ideas in there like we would be helpful to know which buildings would be affected by each policy structure, so some more analysis. Related to that was, could there be a mix of both? So absolute emission limits for newer, larger buildings, trajectory customized for older and smaller buildings, and the value of having the customized approach for older buildings, that having that, or at least a separate trajectory for each one. And then a note that the trajectory approach does seem better because the state RPS is already moving us along there, and there could be an unintended consequence which relates to reducing, especially I think, rental housing supply, which causes more displacement, gentrification, and that could be if the absolute emission limits are so hard to reach for those poor performing buildings that the owner just decides it's time to take that building down and take it out of stock. And then there was a note from Cliff regarding other pathways to find the most impactful strategies for owners, and this goes back to Michael's earlier question. IMT shared that there is a building performance action plan approach that's customized for edge cases.
Okay, thanks, Vin. Andrea, how about your group?
I too heard about unintended consequences and that people wanted, because we haven't had the health standards part of this yet. So like, it was a lot. I think the overarching comment that I heard was very wonky, a little over our head, not necessarily enough information to be able to even weigh in a way that was helpful, but also a desire for a lot of people were like, I both and I like this part of it and this part, and maybe there could be a hybrid. And then obviously, I think a lot of concerns from folks that are in the regulated affordable housing world or like institutional campuses like PPS, thinking about portfolios and constraints is obviously a really big deal. And that we will have separate tables for some of those users and impacted property owners to delve into their specific questions and needs.
Thanks, Andrea. Irene, how about your group?
Yeah, so we talked about similar things as well as talking about the hybrid approach. So can absolute be the default and trajectory an option? And so there's some strong opinions that trajectory would not be a good approach. And let's see here, that it'd be kind of really incompatible with building life cycles, and it would incentivize owners to meet their goals. And let's see. And then for the fourth question, so implementation was a key issue. So for folks who don't have, who are smaller property owners, what does it look like for them to comply, and who don't have portfolio managers and who'd have to sort of, all this reporting might be a barrier and a burden to them. So, this question about can there be support for implementation for those folks who are smaller property owners?
Thank you. Irene. Were you done? Okay. Derek, how about you?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat too much of what has already been said because ours echoes as well. Yeah, there were more questions I think, and there were answers just because folks didn't really understand it as best they could. But I think what is best at serving low-hanging fruit was one of the responses. So a trajectory approach might be a little better at doing that. There was some feedback about low-income investments and the need for folks to not be pushed out, and what would be best for that. What resources exist for building owners so that the costs just aren't passed down to tenants. I think that goes back to the split incentive problem that we often face. I think there was some preference for the trajectory model between the folks in my group. Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk. We just have 1 minute, and I don't want to cut my group out of the recap. So I'll just say very quickly that we also talked about the fact that this may not be a one-size-fits-all approach, that different building types might have different needs, and different building types like multifamily, for example, might have more built-in equity considerations. And the idea that building life cycles are really important to making sure that we take those into account and don't put owners in a position of having to do something silly. Like buying something new that they just bought a few years before. So gosh, I want to thank you all, because this is head splitting kind of stuff, right? To try to think about and project out. So thank you all for sticking with it. And Ben, will you close us out before we hit 2:31?
Yes, thank you, everybody. Next topic is health resilience and temperature standards. And we're really kind of learning still. And then that's meeting 3, and meeting 4, we'll come back to this. It's not the only time we are continuing to evolve like our thinking around this. So this isn't the last opportunity to provide input. So I just want to assure everybody of that. We still have more meetings to come. So thank you for your time so far, and I hope to see you again. And then we'll send out a note about the combined working group meeting, and another meeting where we can really work with the tenant working group as well on things like resources to help comply and sort through some more details. So I will send that invite out to everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your hard work today.
Thank you for the conversation.